My name is Thomas R. Buckner, and I'm in Jackson, Tennessee today, July 16, 2007, to interview Charles Metcalf Crump of Memphis. This interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. State your name, please, sir.
Charles Metcalf Crump.
And your date and place of birth.
October 9th, 1913, in Memphis, Tennessee.
Tell us about your family, your parents and grandparents.
Well, my grandparents on my father's side, that would be the Crump family, they came from Holly Springs, Mississippi. James Moore Crump. There were two sons. My father was Dabney Crump and his brother Frank Crump, and two sisters. They moved to Memphis in the 1880s. My grandfather was in the business of operating a store, and my father had several jobs, and then he and his brother, Frank Crump, formed F.M. Crump and Company Cotton Merchants. Now, on my mother's side, that's the Metcalf side, Charles Wesley Metcalf, for whom I was named, was born in Nicholasville, Kentucky. That's near Danville in mid-Kentucky. He was in the Confederate Army. He was at Shiloh. He was not wounded there, but he had bad asthma from which he suffered the rest of his life. He was sent to a hospital in Memphis for treatment of the asthma. My grandmother, who was Mary Park family were somewhat prominent in Memphis at the time. She was working as a nurse in the hospital. They met, and he never went back to Kentucky. He read law, and the city directory, if you can imagine, in the middle of the Civil War, a published city directory showed C.W. Metcalf, lawyer, 1865, gave his address. So he had read law and began practice, and that is the beginning of our firm.
And you were born in 1913, and tell us about your schooling, elementary school and high school.
Well, I went the first 6 grades at Miss Pentecost School. Miss Pentecost was from Brownsville, Tennessee, and my father's first cousin was E.H. Crump, and they employed Miss Pentecost to tutor Edward Jr. and Robert, the 2 older boys. And then he suggested that she start a school. And so she had Edward, Robert, and John of E.H. Crump, my cousin Frank Crump, my brother Dabney Crump, and then I came along, and I was there from 20 to 26, 1920 to 26, 6 grades. Then I skipped, she pushed us along, so I skipped the 7th and 8th, and entered Memphis University School, known as MUS, then on Manassas and Monroe, way almost downtown, and went there from the 9 through 12, graduated in June of 1930. I then went to Southwestern. It's now known as Rhodes College, but then Southwestern at Memphis. And I was there from 30 to 34, received a BA degree. Then I went to the University of Virginia Law School in 34 and graduated in 37 with an LLB.
Tell us about your childhood hobbies and any part-time or summer work you may have had growing up.
Well, my father had bought a farm near Capeville. That's about 15 miles southeast of Memphis. And that was a full working farm, a dairy and row crops. We had a nice residence on that, and every summer that I can remember, the moment school was out, we went out to the farm and spent the whole summer on the farm. I took my shoes off and didn't put them back on until I was heading for town. We were just a few miles from Capelville. There was no Episcopal church there, so we went to the Methodist church, still barefooted, and that was a wonderful experience on the farm.
How did you choose Southwestern for college?
Well, I knew that I was going to law school, and I really knew I was going to the University of Virginia.
How did you know that?
That was just that's just the way it was.
Had you had relatives that had gone to school there?
Well, my uncle Will Metcalf, who entered the law practice with my grandfather, had gone to Virginia, finished in the 1890s, and then he had an associate, John Apperson, who likewise had gone there. He was in the office. And in fact, the two of them were virtually the whole office. They would have a lawyer in for a year or two. But when I came in '37, there were just the three lawyers there.
Did you know your grandfather who began the firm, he fought in the Civil War?
Oh, I knew, because I was about 10 years old when he died. And he lived next door to us. I was born at 1370 Union Avenue, which is 3 doors east of Cleveland on the north side. They were at 1362 right next door. And they had a front porch across the house and high back rocking chairs. And my recollection is sitting in one of those chairs with my grandfather there telling stories.
Did your grandfather speak of the Civil War?
No, I don't. No, I don't believe he was ever in the fighting in any way.
How about the early days of his law practice? Did he talk about that much?
I can't remember that he did. He talked about the time in Nicholasville, and he was a great humorist, and I, to this day, still have a little difficulty separating fact from fiction. One story I do remember, and I imagine this has more fiction than fact in it. He said that this is when he was growing up there. A man put a rifle in the corner of the house, leaning up against the chimney. And he said it stayed there so long that the barrel bent. And when he would shoot, he would have to compensate for the curvature of the barrel. Now, he told me that as a gospel truth story, but I feel sure that was one of those humorists.
What are your memories of Southwestern?
Well, very good. I really got involved in a lot of things, the fraternity. I had been student manager of basketball for 2 years at MUS. And so my sophomore year, the former student manager didn't return to college, and so the office was vacant. And I went out for it, and the coaches selected me to be the student manager. So I managed football for 3 years. I managed basketball and track for 1 year, and then some others took over. And that gave me a boost. And I was involved in various activities. I was on the Honor Council. My last year I was vice president of student body. I was president of the fraternity, Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity. And so it was a very satisfying experience.
And how about your memories at law school at Virginia?
Law school, my first year, I roomed with my cousin Robert Metcalf Jr., Um, and then the second year I lived on the range, and the third year I lived on the lawn. Now you had to be an applicant for a degree to live on the lawn. And I heard that right after I arrived in the fall of '34, so I went to the dean's office and signed up for a room on the lawn. And when 2 years later, when I was coming up for my degree, I was pretty high on the list, and I selected the room 23 West Lawn. And
Now,
so
what is the lawn?
the lawn, the rotunda is a beautiful building that you see a round top on it and columns. That is at the upper end of the lawn. The lower end is Cabell Hall, a long, low building, and on each side, west and east side, is this colonnade with round white columns, and about every probably 8 or 10 rooms, 8 rooms, there would be a 2-story building called a pavilion. And that was either a professor's home or it was filled with classrooms. But the rotunda and the lawn are really they're the keynote of the University of Virginia.
Did you receive a nice education in law school? Was it worthwhile?
Oh yes, yes. It's well, we considered it then and still do the best law school in the country.
What were your favorite subjects?
Oh, well, I guess contracts would be one of the best. That was a first year major subject. And then we had real property, personal property, and various others.
When did you take the bar exam?
At the end of my second year, the end of June, there were several reasons for that. Number one, the courses, the first 2 years of law school, are the basic courses, and they constitute most of the questions on the bar exam. So you're really better prepared after 2 years, and the third year are a lot of electives, and there are not many questions of that. Secondly, we took it at the end of June, and in those days they graded the papers, and I knew in August that I had passed the bar. So which meant that you could, by September 1st, you were ready to go to the practice as a lawyer.
But you returned to UVA for your third year of law school.
Yes, oh, absolutely.
After graduation, what did you do?
Well, well, that summer, a friend of mine who was at VMI and I spent 7 weeks traveling in Europe.
Was that Merrill Pascoe?
Merrill Pascoe, who graduated from VMI the year I finished law school, and then he went to Virginia Law and practiced with a big firm in Richmond.
Where in Europe did you and Merrill travel?
We made the grand tour. England, Scotland, France, Italy, through Austria, piece of it, Germany, Holland, Belgium, back to Paris and home.
And this is the summer of 1937.
Correct.
Okay, did you travel to Munich?
We did, and I know the question is, what was Hitler doing then? Well, I can tell you where he was one day because I did see him. We were in Munich and went up to Nuremberg, planning to go to Rothenburg, an old, beautiful walled city just out of Nuremberg. We arrived by train about noon, little afternoon, and walking down the street, we saw a crowd around this hotel and swastika-covered cars under the porte-cochere. And we saw an English youth there, and he said, Hitler's having lunch there, and he's going to come out on that balcony up there in a little while. So I got my Leica camera out, and while Merrill was giving him Heil Hitler, because when it robed as the Romans do, I took 2 pictures of him, and I have 2. The main thing you can see is his mustache.
Did Merrill travel to Berlin after that?
Merrill had studied German, and so he wanted to go to Berlin, but I didn't want to go to the big city, so I went down to Stuttgart, and that's right at the beginning of the Black Forest. And I rented a bicycle in Stuttgart and spent 3 days bicycling down to Freiburg, and then on up, and we met in Heidelberg about 4 days after we had parted.
Was there a young lady that you met in Europe while you were there?
Oh, well, there was a girl at Sweetbriar College, which is near Virginia, and I had seen her that spring, and her mother was married to a Dutch professor. They lived in Leiden, a suburb of The Hague, and she said she would be there, and why didn't we stop by? So we had an evening and spent the night with the family. They had some young people in. It was quite fun.
And after you returned to the U.S., you began practicing law in Memphis?
September 1st, 1937.
With your uncle's firm?
Yes, just my uncle Will Metcalf, John Apperson, and Charlie Jester was just about a year or 2 out of law school.
And what was the first case that you handled?
Well, the first case I tried was a divorce case, oddly enough. I didn't do a whole lot of divorce, but that happened to be the first one.
And what was your pay as a beginning lawyer?
Well, I guess 2 things. I was working for my uncle, and he had a theory that the first year or so, 2 or 3 years, a young lawyer out of law school would receive more benefit from the law firm in being ready to practice law than he just received more benefit, therefore he didn't receive any salary. He did give me my fees. I earned one fee of $15 in probate court, being a guardian ad litem for a matter, and then I collected a note for $250, and I got half of that, so I made $140 the first year.
And when did your regular salary begin?
Well, in July the 20th, 1940, Don and I were married. But unfortunately, Uncle Billy, as I called him, had developed prostate cancer the fall before. And he was ill all that last year there. And he died at 7:30 that evening, following our wedding at 4:30. And so we went on the honeymoon for about 10 days and came back, and as of August 1st, John Apperson and I formed a partnership, Metcalf, Apperson, and Crump. August 1st, 1940. That is the foundation of the present firm, which is Apperson, Crump, and Maxwell. Let me just say this further about the John Apperson was never a partner of my uncle. It was always my uncle's firm, but he called it Metcalf, and Apperson. But then we made it Metcalf, Apperson, and Crump.
And where were you living when you married? And after you married, where did you live?
You mean in Memphis?
In Memphis, yes.
I lived, well, we rented a house on Clark and Court for about a year, and then we built a house in Tuckahoe subdivision, which we had formed in 1938. That's at Poplar and Goodland, that area. And we built and moved into that house October 1st, 1941.
Now, how did you and Mrs. Crump meet?
She lived right down the street in Hyde Park on West Drive, about 3 or 4 doors from my Uncle Robert Metcalf, who had a daughter about her age. And I had met her sometime in the earlier days, but she was at Hollins College for 2 years, and then her mother died, so her father wanted her to stay in Memphis and go to Southwestern. In June, 1st of June of 1939, we were at a reception at Southwestern, right out in front of the Palmer Hall, and they have it every year during graduation. And she was going to enter the college that fall, and so she was there, and I saw her, and things began at that point.
Now tell us about your proposal to her, when you proposed to her.
Well, I dated her all that summer and all the next winter. She was going steady with somebody else, but I managed to edge him out. And she was a lady in waiting at the Cotton Carnival for the Lamar Club. Her sister was a member, and she asked me to be her escort. And so the first night of Carnival, the barge comes up the river. We go to the University Club and park the car and go on a bus down below the bridge. And this particular time, we were on the barge, and just as it entered Wolf River, the heavens opened up and it poured down rain. And so we landed at the foot of Monroe, because those days the mayor would give the king a key to the city at the Federal Building, post office and Federal Building at the head of Madison Avenue and Front Street. So we ran up that hill, and she was pretty well tuckered out, and I knew the referee in bankruptcy, Carl Graves. He used to teach me in Sunday school, and he had a couch in his office, so she went in to lie down there, and we missed the court, the bus for the court going to 19th Century Club, and then we knew they were going to the country club, Memphis Country Club. So Carl Graves dropped us at the University Club. We picked up our car, and we drove around, and our house at 4110 Poplar, it was then, now 4110 Tuckahoe, it was a very safe place to park in the driveway. So we parked a while there, and in the course of that parking, I popped the question, and that's when we became engaged.
After law practice began, did you work hard at the law? Was it a very strenuous occupation?
Oh yes, I gave it full time.
Mm-hmm. Where were you on December 7, 1941?
I remember my parents were living at 4110 Tuckahoe, but we were around 163 Tuckahoe Lane, and it was our custom. I had a brother who was married, and he and his wife and Don and I would have Sunday lunch with my parents. My father had died in May of 41, so it was only my mother. And I remember we were having lunch there, and over the radio came this report that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. That's when I first heard about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is your wife's full name?
Diana Temple Wallace, now Crump.
And after Pearl Harbor, what was your service in the military?
How's that?
After Pearl Harbor and the nation was at war,
yeah.
Did you enlist in the military?
Yes. I was a little late getting in for this reason. I had been in the legislature. It meets every other year, the odd years, in Nashville. Those days we met only for about 6 weeks. Now they go on into the spring and summer. But I went to the 39 legislature. I went back to the 41 legislature, which was before Pearl Harbor. And then my cousin E.H. Crump, who put me there in the first place as the political leader in Shelby County, suggested that the war was going to continue for a while and I should go back for the 43. I was chairman of a judiciary committee and I was sort of head of the Shelby delegation and in the House. So I went back in January and early February of 43. The war was just a year old then. And the day it adjourned, I went to see the Navy Office of Procurement Office. And finally, I applied a few months later. But in August of 43, I got a letter from the Navy saying I was unfit for service because I was nearsighted. I knew that, but I had taken the exam anyway. That was in August of 43. Well, I immediately went to see Dr. Ralph Reitner, who was on the floor below me in the Exchange Building, and said, "What can I do about these eyes?" And he says, "Well, the Navy wants to be fooled, and we can fool them." The Memphis Optical that made the glasses was owned by the ophthalmologist, and is on the 7th floor. And he said, and I was in the Exchange Building, 18th floor, and he said, "Go down to Miss Robinson at the Memphis Optical, and she will have you read through far-sighted glasses, the opposite from what you are. That means it's going to change the shape of the eyeball, reading through the straining to read through far-sighted glasses." And after about 2 months of that, I went back to the Navy Procurement Office, which was in the Steric Building just a block away, and took the test over again. And I brought it up from 920 to 1220. And that was sufficient that I received a commission in early November. And my active duty was to report in January. So I had to keep on taking these exercises. I went from August to late December because I had to take another test before my active duty. And I did pass that sufficiently.
So at age 30, you entered the Navy.
Yes.
And what was your service like in the Navy? What did you do?
Well, I was very fortunate. I got my first choice along the way. I wanted to be an air combat intelligence officer. And the school, first there was an indoctrination school at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, in the aviation branch. I was a line officer, but in the aviation branch. And I went to the indoctrination school and then requested ACI school and was assigned to that and stayed right there at Quonset for another about 10 weeks for that. And I had Diana, and she brought, by that time we had our first son, Ben. And she came up, and we had very pleasant living conditions on the lighthouse point of Wickford, Rhode Island. Wickford is an old, traditional New England town, just about 5 miles or so from Quonset Point. And a officer from New Orleans brought his wife and 2 sons up, and we had a most delightful time there. But after I finished ACI school, I was sent to Norfolk for further orders. Well, I requested a dive bombing squadron, carrier-based, training on the East Coast, going to the Pacific. That's exactly what I got, fortunately. At Norfolk, they had just were finishing construction of the aircraft carrier Shangri-La. When Jimmy Doolittle made his raid over Tokyo in the spring of '42, they asked President Roosevelt, where did those planes come from? And he looked up in the sky and a falsetto voice said, from Shangri-La. Well, that was the mythical kingdom in the book Lost Horizon by James Hilton. And it had been named because of that. And so the Shangri-La was built right there, so we were assigned to it. Well, first I went to the squadron, which was at Wildwood, New Jersey, an air station near Cape May. And an air group on a carrier at that time had a dive bombing squadron, a torpedo squadron, and a fighter squadron. They formed separate places, and then the air group came together on Cape Cod.
Now, what were your responsibilities as an intelligence officer?
Essentially, briefing and interrogating pilots. All during this period of all the way out to the Pacific. Briefing them, training them in recognition of ships and planes, so they could tell the difference between a friendly and a foe.
Now, when did the Shangri-La arrive in the Pacific at the front?
Well, we went on shakedown in November, December to Trinidad. And then we came back to Norfolk. I got home for leave over Christmas, and then in mid-January we went through the canal to San Diego and then to the Hawaiian Islands. And we stayed, the ship's ordnance department wasn't up to snuff, and so they kept the ship there in the Hawaiian Islands, and we were over on the island of Maui for about 6 weeks, awaiting the training of the ship's ordnance. And then about the 1st of April, we departed for the Pacific and arrived at Okinawa and did a what they call close air support. The ground troops, we had maps, very detailed maps of Okinawa in 8x8 form, which fit into the board of the pilot, the plotting board. And the troops would be going up a road, and they would encounter a machine gun nest, we'll say, in a haystack at the corner of 2 roads. And so the commander would call up and say, take map so-and-so at coordinate B3. You see at the northwest corner is a haystack. The pilot would, yes, see that. Well, there's a machine gun in there. It's got us pinned down. We can't move. So the planes then, circling about 12,000 feet, would dive down and bomb that haystack and knock out the machine gun nest, and the troops could move up. That's called close air support. And that was essentially what we were doing at Okinawa.
Now, the Battle of Okinawa was May and June of '45.
It began the 1st of April to the middle of June.
After June, what did you do?
Well, when Okinawa was pretty much secured, we went down to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to form a task force going up to the home islands. And about the 1st of July, we left Lady Gulf, and probably the largest armada ever assembled, including the Spanish Armada. We had 5 task groups, 4 American and 1 British. They had anywhere from 3 to 5 carriers, 1 or 2 battleships, 1 or 2 cruisers, and a whole string of destroyers all around the group. And so the 5 task groups cruised up to the home islands, and from about the 10th of July until the 15th of August, we roamed up and down the coast of the home islands, from Hokkaido down to Kyushu. We were essentially knocking out ships and planes because we were preparing for the invasion. It was planned to be in Kyushu, the southern island, which is very rugged. That was to be in October of 1945. And then in January of 46 was to be a landing on the Tokyo plain. You go right into Tokyo. Well, fortunately, with our attacks on the shipping and planes, but mainly the 2 bombs were dropped on the 6th and 9th of August, and that encouraged them to seek peace.
What was the reaction of the naval personnel to the dropping of the atomic bombs?
Well, there was a absolute total surprise to us. We had a ship's newspaper. Those days it was a mimeograph. You don't see mimeograph much anymore, but we had legal, about 2 or 3 sheets. And the day after it was dropped, they reported it, and about the radioactive influence and how long it would last. And it was total surprise. And we had no inkling that it was coming. But after they didn't get the message after the first one dropped on Hiroshima. But after the second one on Nagasaki, they began. When I really date the war being over about on the 10th of August, because we had a strike that day into airfields. We were not too far from the Tokyo area. And that evening we were in the ready room. That's where each squadron had its own ready room, comfortable chairs, and that's where I would brief the pilots and crewmen on the mission. And we were in there, and they were feeling no pain after having had a strike that day. Well, Admiral McCain was task force commander.
So John McCain's father? Senator John McCain's grandfather.
The senator's grandfather.
Yes.
His son, the father of the senator, was a submariner. And he was in submarines with George Griner. George was a longtime friend of mine who went to the Naval Academy, and he made 9 war patrols, if you can imagine that.
He practiced law with your firm?
He did.
After the war?
That's right. He had a little heart condition and had to get out of the Navy and came with us. But McCain, his office, on a carrier, you have the hangar deck is the main deck, and that's about 3 inches of steel plate. And then way up above that is the flight deck, which is 4 inches of wood on a thin metal. And hanging just below that, not in the middle, but on each side, that's called the gallery deck, and the ready rooms were there, and the Admiral had his office there, right across the corridor from our door to the ready room. Well, about 9:15 that night, Friday, August 10th, the door opened slowly, and the ACI officer on Admiral's staff, his name was Longstreth, he was about 6 feet 3 or 4 or 5, ducked down, came in the door, and he said in almost a casual tone, we're getting word that the Japanese are trying to surrender. And the pilot said, Stretch, get out of here. You're demoralizing us. We're fighting a war. Don't you realize that? And here you are giving us that sort of talk? And so he slunk out and went back across the corridor to his office. And there was a clock right above the door. And right at exactly 9 o'clock on August the 10th, I'll never forget, I get a metal picture of it right now. Right at 9 o'clock, that door flew open, Stretch jumped inside, pointed up, and looked up at the sky and says, it's true, it's true. We have confirmation that the Japanese are trying to surrender through Switzerland. Now that to me was when the war was really over. Now, for 5 more days, we had operations. And while they were negotiating what we were going to do about the emperor and things like that. But, and finally, Halsey put out a message, if you see some Japanese planes, shoot them down, but in a very friendly fashion.
That was Admiral Halsey, who was a naval
right.
commander.
That's right. So then on the 5th day, August the 15th, we had a flight going into the Tokyo plain area, not quite Tokyo, but that area, and is called a pre-dawn takeoff, and I had gotten up early to brief them and get them out. Well, as soon as they took off, which was before dawn, they were going to be gone 4 hours, I went back to bed. And right at 7:30, over the bullhorn, now hear this. This is the captain speaking. We have just received word that the war is over and we have called our planes back. Well, that was the real word. That was over.
After that, what did your ship do?
Well, first, what did the pilots do? Every single one of them dropped those bombs into the water. Because if the captain had called back and said, belay that, go to the target. Sorry, sir, we've dropped our bombs because we want to drop them before we come aboard the ship anyway. So then we had 2 weeks there. Well, one thing they did, they took some publicity pictures. And my skipper, the dive bomber had a rear seat, radio gunner. But my skipper invited me to fly with him. And they had, they got all the planes they could from all these 5 test groups up in the air and lined them up. And with the cameras rolling, we flew over the fleet. And that was quite a sight. And then we kept planes over the islands all that time. We didn't want anybody to mistake that the war was over. And so we had planes flying over there. Now, the surrender was on the deck of the Missouri, because Truman was president, as a battleship, in Tokyo Bay. Well, that was to be on the 2nd of September. Well, on the 28th of August, we had planes going every day, all day. And my skipper again invited me to fly over Tokyo with him in the rear seat. And we went up, and that's probably the most hazardous flight I ever took, because planes were just going everywhere at about 100 feet off of the ground over Tokyo. But I did get to see it all bombed out, just building after building, these high-rise buildings bombed out. But the Imperial Palace, which is on an island, it was all just as green as it could be. And then coming back to the ship from Tokyo, and the purpose of our flight, as I said, was to let the Japanese know that we were there and meant business, and not to try any foolishness, which they didn't. And coming back, though, flying down Tokyo Bay back to the ocean, the old Tennessee battleship, the old style, shaped like that, was leading the whole fleet up to Tokyo for the surrender. That made me feel a little bit proud. That was the USS Tennessee.
After the surrender, what did you do in the Navy?
Well, the day after the surrender, we were supposed to have been relieved by another air group sometime in that latter part of August. But they thought that they better keep an experienced squadron air group there in case the Russians tried to do anything. And so we stayed there. The day after this surrender, we transferred at sea to what they call a jeep carrier, escort carrier, the USS Attu, much smaller ship. And our replacement air group had come out on the Attu, and for the first time in history, two air groups swapped ships at sea. What we were doing, we were cruising along, maybe 100 feet apart, and they had whips or lines going across, and they would take one group over. For the officers, they had two chairs lashed back to back. For the enlisted men, they put a cargo net down and put a bunch of them on it, picked it up like that, took it over, and then all of our baggage transferred. And at the end of the day, we were on the Attu, and our replacement was on the Shangri-La. It took us about 3 weeks to get back. And we came into San Diego. We'd gone out through San Diego, we came back through San Diego. And I've always have a soft spot in my heart for the people of San Diego, because as we came in, there's a big pier there, and it has a warehouse on it. And I guess in letters 15, 20 feet tall, they had "Well done, welcome home." And as we went down the gangway to leave the ship for the last time, the ladies of the city were there at the end of the gangway with cartons of fresh milk. We hadn't had any milk in at least 6 months or more, and they were giving us fresh milk. And so we came ashore, and our squadron and air group were decommissioned right there at Coronado Heights in San Diego.
After the war started, did you see your friend Merrill Pascoe?
I did. When I was at Wildwood, New Jersey, which is fairly close to Washington, I had occasion to fly over to Washington one day. I called him up, it was about lunchtime, and he had me come to his office. His desk was right outside of General Marshall's office door.
That's George Marshall, the chairman of the Chief of Staff of...
That's right. He was a VMI graduate, and he wouldn't have anybody around him except VMI graduates. And Merrill and one other aide were his two aides with him all the time. And you couldn't get into couldn't get into Marshall's office without passing Merrill's desk. And he had a little sign on it, "If you open this door, come in." And I said, "What's that mean?" He said the general couldn't stand it for somebody to push the door, peep in, and close the door. He said, "If you open this door, come in." But
And did you spend the night at Fort Myers?
When I was going from Quonset after ACI school, and we was going to catch the train. See, we had our car with us. We go to Norfolk. The route was to come down through New York, Washington, and Charlottesville was the closest point from the Southern Railroad to Norfolk. And so I wrote Merrill and said, "Could we spend the night with you as we come through Washington?" And he, of course, graciously said yes. And when we got there, he put us up in this nice room, and we realized that was the master bedroom that he'd given to us. Well, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard the phone ring. Well, we had a phone in that room, but I didn't pick it up. But I could hear his muffled voice. And I didn't know it at the time. But when we got to Memphis, after riding the train 24 hours, and got in there, I think it was the 7th of June, the newspaper announced the landings on June the 6th. Well, after the war, Merrill told me that phone call that night had been from General Eisenhower in Europe, wanted to get permission to postpone the landings one day because of bad weather. You recall there was bad weather. And he could not reach General Marshall, so he was calling Merrill Pascoe to track down General Marshall to get permission to postpone the landings one day. So we were where history was being made.
Very good. This might be a nice spot for a break, Charles.
Yes, be fine.
Thank you. Charles, have you had occasion to return to Japan after the war?
Yes, some years ago, I represented a Japanese company that came into Memphis and did a steel slitting business. And so they suggested that we might want to come over there and they would entertain us. We paid for our trip, but they entertained us there. And so we did fly into Tokyo, and the man had come to Memphis to set the plane up, was named Ken Suzuki. I just love that name, Ken Suzuki, and his wife, his name is Maki. Very attractive. And so then we went there, and then Kyoto, which is a marvelous city, and we did get out to Hiroshima. To see that where the first bomb was dropped. And there is a park, and there's a burned out building that is still there. That's the symbol of it. And so we did have that occasion. Now, I should have mentioned, while we were in Okinawa, that was still very part of the kamikaze season. That was the suicide planes that the Japanese flew over the fleet and dived on ships. They were suicide planes. And we had the Bunker Hill was an aircraft carrier, our same class, and it was just a few miles from us, and it was hit by one of these, and we saw this column of black smoke going up from it. And just before we left Pearl Harbor to go out to Okinawa, the Franklin, which was a carrier that had been terribly beaten up off the coast of Japan, came and tied up right, it was coming back to the States, and it tied up right next to us. So that was not a very pleasant sight to be sent off to the war zone.
After your active duty in the Navy, have you been on cruises, pleasure cruises?
Yes, Don and I took about 10 or 12 cruises, almost all on the Vista Fjord, an old Norwegian liner, and we went to various places, mostly the Baltic, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. We went to Tahiti, in that area, and we've enjoyed it.
Tell us about the births of your 3 sons.
Well, my oldest, Charles Metcalf Crump Jr., we call him Met, M-E-T for short, was born April 25th, 1942, and he was with us up at Quonset, up at Wickford, and Wildwood, and on Cape Cod is where the air group formed before we went aboard the ship. Our second son was a result of, his birth was a result of Planned Parenthood. Dr. Ruck, everybody in Memphis knows Dr. Ruck. During the war, he virtually lived at the Baptist Hospital. But I mentioned I got leave after our shakedown cruise and got into Memphis a few days before Christmas. And Donna was great with child at the time. So Dr. Ruck said, "When are you going back?" And I said, "I have to leave on the evening of the 29th to get back to Norfolk." And he said, "Well, is it worth a bottle of whiskey to have your child," didn't say son, because those days he didn't know, "your child born while you were home on leave?" And I said, "It sure is, because I could get whiskey out at the Navy at Billington, and he couldn't." So I got him a bottle of whiskey, and on the afternoon of the 28th, he and Dinah go into the Baptist, and I was up all night, and Philip was born at 7:30 on the morning of the 29th. And I left 7:30 that night on the train to go back to Norfolk to the Pacific, and didn't get home until October. So that was Planned Parenthood. Now the third one is Stephen, who was born in June 1948.
Any stories about your cousin Edward H. Crump that you would like to relay to us?
Well, he was the political leader for half of a century. He died at age 80 in October 1954. And he began his political career right after the turn of the century, when he ran for and won a seat on what would be termed the city council. His success in the political arena is really his ability to judge people, to relate to people, and he would pick the right people to run and that support. He would not necessarily talk them into running, but people who were running he would support. And he built an organization, and it was a good organization and good government. There was never any, the one time there was a little scandal, and the city judge and the city court clerk had a little thing going where he would fine John Doe $50 for speeding. And then without John Doe ever coming back into the courtroom, a couple of days later, the blotter would show that fine was remitted to John Doe. Well, it went into the pocket of the clerk and the judge. Now, in some of the other situations, they would have tried to cover that up. But no, they were both prosecuted, and he wouldn't have any part of anything like that.
Now, Edward Hull Crump was your father's first cousin?
First cousin.
And did he have a nickname?
Well, I don't like to refer to that nickname, but some people referred to him as Boss Crump.
When did the nickname Boss Crump first
I don't know.
was first used?
It preceded me, but I didn't give it to him.
E.H. Crump had 3 sons also.
Right.
Tell us about them.
Robert, and John.
And John was killed, I believe.
He was killed in a private plane crash. Commercial appeal plane was flying down in Mississippi to support the Cotton Carnival. It was in advance of the Cotton Carnival to generate interest in it. And landing or takeoff, they crashed, and all 3 of them were killed.
E.H. Crump had great power across the state in politics, not just in Memphis.
That's right.
Explain how that happened.
Well, he just, his personality, his integrity and personality, I would say.
Who are some of his allies and opponents in the arena of politics in those days?
Oh, well, the opponent, Browning, would be the main one.
The main opponent?
Gordon Browning, yeah. In 1936, let's see, the election is in the even year, and to take office January of the next year. He supported Gordon Browning. And right after the election, Browning sent him a telegram. I have 60,000 reasons to be thankful to Shelby County for winning the election. He got 60,000 votes in Shelby County, and that's a pretty big number. And then they went to the legislature, the 37 legislature, and almost as soon as it convened, he did a flip-flop, Browning, and was sponsoring legislation to curtail his power. He wanted to have a sort of unit vote like they did in Georgia for Talmadge and Atlanta. And so he just absolutely turned against. But he ran in the 38 campaign. And that's the one I was running for the state legislature. I was unopposed. But we did see that, and Prentice Cooper was running against Browning. Prentice was fine, as Princeton graduate, and just a wonderful man. And we were supporting Prentice Cooper against Browning, and we beat him. And so.
How about Estes Kefauver?
That's another on the other side, yeah.
What memories do you have of his clashes with Mr. Crump?
Oh, I don't remember any particular, except that he was, and there was a group in Memphis who they supported. Well, the editor of the Press Seminar, Ed Beeman, was his principal opponent in Memphis, and Beeman tried all sorts of things, but
the name Lloyd Benford is well known as a
Lloyd
censor.
T. Benford was the censor, the movie censor, movie and shows, mainly movies, And he, it was an example of Cousin Ed's clean living and no pornography. And Lloyd Benford would ban, they sometimes referred to him as Lloyd Banford, because he would ban movies that had pornography.
What was Mr. Benford's appointed position? Did he have a title?
Censor. He was a censor.
And Mr. Crump appointed him as censor. Was that a governmental position?
Oh, yeah.
In the city government?
Yeah. I don't think we have one now.
I don't believe we do. Let's get back on your law practice.
Okay.
After the war, you came back to the law firm.
Yes.
And tell us about your practice after the war.
Well, that was 1940, February 46. And I guess we were still in the exchange building.
What kind of cases did you handle? Do you remember any cases in
Well,
particular?
I tended, one thing, we represented, let me go back of that. Eugene McGivney was from Ireland, a devout Roman Catholic, and he came over and settled in a little cottage that is next door to the Catholic Church at Adams and Third, and the McGivney Cottage. He had two daughters, Mrs. Hamilton, and a mother superioress of a convent in Galveston, Texas. And when Mrs. Hamilton died, December 1st, 1930, I think without a will, she left an adopted daughter who married a Dr. Kosh, so she was Blanche Hamilton Kosh. Now, my Metcalf family settled on Adams Avenue about 4 or 5 doors east of the McGivney Cottage. And so my mother and my uncle all knew Mrs. Kosh, because she was about the same age. And she came to my Uncle Billy to represent her. She was the adopted daughter, but and therefore would inherit certainly all the personal property. But the immediately after Mrs. Hamilton's death, the McGivney family came out of the woodwork all over the world, and they contested Mrs. Kosh's adoption by Mrs. Hamilton. And the probate court held it was valid, and it went to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held it valid. That meant that she was the daughter of Mrs. Hamilton, and therefore she got all the personal property. But then there was real estate. Miss Hamilton owned from Main and Union south to the first alley, and that included Lena's Ladies' Toggery, which was the finest ladies' shop in Memphis at that time. Next door was the Landry's Company, and then there were 3 more stores, the last one being Stein's Fur Shop. And then there was a building on Union Avenue, so that was a choice piece of real estate in Memphis. And they still argued, well, after she was held to be the daughter, that meant she was equal to the Mother Superioress in Galveston, who had a will that was a religious type will. At any rate, it went back into the courts to determine the real estate. And the Supreme Court ultimately held that Mrs. Hamilton and the Mother Superioress inherited the McGivney real estate, and that therefore Ms. Karsh got half of it, and then we negotiated for the purchase of the other half from the McGivney heirs and the convent.
And your client was whom?
Mrs. Karsh. And so that's what I'm saying is that was a major piece of continuing work in connection with the tenants and various such as that. And then later on, Ms. Karsh died, and she had she had a daughter who had children, and that later I represented a lady, Mrs. Waddell, who developed the tropical freeze at Poplar and White Station Road, and also acquired some of that real estate out there and became rather wealthy. So those two estates were part of my practice through the years.
Tell us about the development of Memphis and how it's changed since you started practice law in 1937 and today, and especially along Poplar Avenue.
Well, glad you asked that, because in those days, in the 30s, there were civic clubs in neighborhoods all over the city. And we lived in the White Station neighborhood. That really ran from the city limits at the time, which was Goodlet and Poplar. There was at the White Station School where they met, there was a White Station Community Improvement Association that was interested in the zoning and the whole neighborhood. Well, there was a Germantown Civic Club. There was a small one at Forest Hill, and then the Collierville Rotary Club filled this bill out at Collierville. Well, Mr. O.H. Miller, who his company was Choctaw Concrete Pipe Company, and he had a fine home on the south side of the new Poplar, almost to Germantown at Riverdale Road. And he had the idea, because he didn't want to see Poplar junked up with commercial, dribbling along the way, similar to some of the other streets. Summer Avenue had various commercial scattered along. And so he had the idea of having all of these civic clubs on Poplar get together and created the Poplar Pike Improvement Association, and had representatives from the clubs along the way. And he asked me to participate in that. And so I did. I drew up a charter and so forth. We didn't incorporate, but each civic club had the president and two other representatives on the Poplar Pike Association. And so I was one of the other I was never president of the White Station Club, but I was secretary of this. And we had my name recorded with the planning commission downtown. And so I would get every notice of anything on Poplar from Goodlet to the county line. And then we would analyze it. If we thought it was bad zoning, we would go down and oppose it. And I am thoroughly convinced, not because I was involved in it, because I give credit to Mr. Miller for thinking about it. I just carried out what he wanted. I have no doubt that the Poplar commercial development and residential both are the result of that effort by that association for a period of about 10 years.
Tell us how the firm grew from your days after the war to the present.
Yeah. Well, it grew very gradually. We were in the Exchange building, and I can't place these dates, but the Exchange building began to have a question about its long-range future. And the 100 North Main building was a brand new building built by Harry Bloomfield, right across the street from the courthouse. And so we moved from the Exchange building up to the 26th floor of the 100 North Main building. And we were there for, I guess 15 years or so. And then we moved from the 100 North Main building to Commerce Square, because it was a more prestigious building. The 100 North Main, it had some problems. And then we were, way back in the 60s, we brought John Maxwell into the firm. He had been in the Army, but he went to law school and came with us. And for some reason, he got into the Naval Reserve, and he met Bob Willis, a builder. That kind of put us into the real estate development practice. And as a result of that, those builders didn't like to come downtown. They had dirty shoes because they were walking around in the mud. And so we opened an office in the Ridge Lake development, right up the street from that circular hotel. And that was our start with an East Office location.
Was your firm the first firm that had an East Office, larger firm?
I wouldn't say it was, this is one of the first. And it was a branch office. The main office was downtown. We want everybody to know that. But and then, of course, later on we moved up on Kirby Parkway. And then we finally decided to close the downtown a few years ago, and we're at 6,000 Poplar now.
Was Bob McRae a partner of yours at one time?
He was. Interesting. We had a fellow, his name escapes me at the moment, but he was at University of Virginia Law School, and he had committed to come into our office. And just weeks before the 1st of June, when they graduated.
What year was this?
Oh, we were still in the Exchange building. really can't place it.
In the
exactly.
1950s, perhaps?
Oh yeah, it was, that's right. It was. And just before he was to come, he communicated with us and he said, I have received an offer to clerk for a judge, I think a federal judge. But don't worry, I've got a substitute for me. He's here at Virginia. His name is Bob McCrae. And that's how Bob came to our office. We'd never seen him. He came to substitute for somebody we did know. And of course, that was fortuitous. And Bob was a wonderful lawyer. Then he became very good friends with C.B. Dudley. And C.B. was with Jerry Blanchard. They were over the Commerce title building. And
Then Bob became a judge after he left your firm. And
one day Louise, his wife, called me and said, Bob would really like to be a judge, and would you manage his campaign? Well, in those days, the Bar Association held a primary. And they voted until one of several candidates had a majority. So there were two others, Irving Strauch and Bill O'Hearn. And, well, we eliminated O'Hearn the first day, and we eliminated Strauch the second day, and Bob won the primary. That was the endorsement in the general election. And he had opposition in the general election, but we won that pretty hands down. So he was the Division 4 of the Circuit Court for just a few years, and a vacancy opened up on the federal bench, and he was appointed to that.
On the federal bench, one of his cases was the school busing case.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that, and also about the change in race relations in Memphis from the 30s to the present.
Well, of course, in the 30s and on up, much after that, on up to, what was the Board of Education's case was 54, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes.
And Bob, he really took a lot of flack on that school busing. And but he felt he had to do it. I remember we invited them to come to dinner one night at our house on Tuckahoe. And the U.S. Marshal drove them out there. They asked us to pull the shades down in the dining room so people on the street couldn't see he was in our house. A marshal would drive him to town every day to his office as judge. And he would take a different route, just out of safety's sake. So, and I got involved in that to some extent. The sanitation strike began in January.
What year?
67 or 68, 68, I believe it was. Oh yeah, 68, sure. And there was a change in city government at the time. They went to the mayor council. And Henry Loeb was mayor, and they had a 13-member council that came in. And all of that worked, and this sanitation strike, and it went on from January, and sometime in March, around the middle of March, there was an Episcopal priest, I'm an Episcopalian, Episcopal priest named Bill Kephart, who had contacts with the black community, particularly Jim Lawson, who was at the Centenary Methodist Church on McLemore, and Ralph Jackson, not Ralph Abernathy, but Ralph Jackson, who was head of the minimum salary department of the black church that then occupied the Second Presbyterian Church down on Hernando. And he said he wanted us, a group of us, and he called together Fred Beeson, John Salmon, Joe Ogle III, John T. Fisher, and me, maybe somebody else, and arranged for a Saturday afternoon session with Jim Lawson and Ralph Jackson at Lawson's church on McLemore. Well, it happened that was the weekend that Martin Luther King came to Memphis sometime earlier than that, and they had a march that began at this Second Presbyterian, former Second Presbyterian Church, went down Hernando to Beale, and up Beale to Main, turned on Main, and some black punks began to break store windows, and the whole thing ended up in a riot. They had to spirit Martin Luther King away from there for his own safety's sake. So he had to come back to Memphis to see that he could lead a march, because he was planning a big march in Washington. If he couldn't lead one in Memphis without blowing up, no way to go to Washington. And so they planned this march on a Friday. Well, the second biggest snow in the history of Memphis came on Thursday night and Friday morning. They canceled the march because the snow was almost 17 inches in March the 17th in the 1880s or 90s, 1890s it was. But we had scheduled to meet with them on Saturday afternoon, and I remember as we drove into the parking lot, snow was still inches deep in their parking lot. So we listened and talked to them for about 3 hours with all the problems they were having. And finally, about 5 o'clock, I said to Jim Lawson, I said, "You've got a church service here tomorrow. How in the world can you spend all of Saturday afternoon with the group of us who have no base of power? We just wanted to come talk with you." And his response was, "You are the first white people who have wanted to talk with us since the sanitation strike began." So that impressed us. So we drove down to Lennon's, had a barbecue place on McLemore, on Bellevue, just north of McLemore. And we drove down there and sat in a booth and drank Cokes and talked about it. And we formed a organization we called Memphis Community Leadership Training. And we had black-white breakfasts and other meetings in the afternoons. I remember particularly, I guess it was Reggie Wurzburg was at one of those meetings, and he was in a room. We had one-on-one conversations. He was in a room with a young black militant, and the young black said to Mr. Wurzburg, "Now, Mr. Wurzburg, you just don't understand. We've been oppressed for 200 years. And Reggie turned to him and said, "Son, we've been oppressed for 2,000 years. And we had one big meeting up in Paris Landing at the hotel up there. We had probably 100 people there for the weekend. They came in on Friday afternoon and Saturday night, all day Friday night on a Saturday, and we had a lot of one-on-one conversations. And finally, it was Sunday afternoon, and I was president of this group, and I called them to order Sunday afternoon, all around the outside of the ballroom. And the first crack out of the box, this young black with the 20-millimeter shell around his neck spoke up and said, "I just want to say something. I've always hated cops. They're just always terrible. But old Joe over there," and he pointed to a young white man, "is a cop. And he and I got to rapping yesterday afternoon, and we got a whole lot of understanding." And about that time, Joe stood up and says, "Well, Randy there, he's a militant, and you can just tell he's a militant. But we did get an understanding." And that set the tone for that whole afternoon. And I don't know, it may have done some good in that period of time, but we lasted for several years.
After Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination,
Yeah.
How did Memphis change?
Well, interesting. I said, if anybody needed, nobody could have had a better alibi that he didn't shoot Martin Luther King than I did, because I was about to try a lawsuit. And there was some particular aspect of it that I wanted Bob McCrae's. He was then on the federal bench, and it wouldn't be before him, but it was in the circuit court. So I wanted to talk to him about some aspect of that lawsuit. And I went by his house. And he and I were sitting in the little den on one side of the house, and about 6 o'clock at night, 6:15 at night, Tuck, his youngest son, who'd been watching television in the living room, came running in and said, "Martin Luther King's been shot." He is on television. He was watching it. I was, at the time he was shot, I was talking with the federal judge. So I said, that's pretty good answer there. I think there's no doubt that had an effect in changing, but people a lot of people were working to bring an understanding between the races.
Now, you have been active in the Episcopal Church
Yes.
for many years.
Well,
What
almost
duties,
all my life.
what official duties have you held with the church?
Well, I guess the main thing is the Episcopal Church has about 100 dioceses. In Tennessee, we now have 3, West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee and East Tennessee. And then the diocese has an annual convention. But the national church, really it's international, we have a few overseas, has a general convention every 3 years. Every 3 years. And I have been a deputy to the General Convention since 1958. That's 17 conventions over a period of, 3 times 17 is roughly 50 years. One more year, and it'll be 50 years. And that's by 4 conventions longer than anybody else has been there. So that, and I was vice president of that at one time. And I've been on the executive council and the commissions that's been my main. And I have been chancellor of the that's lawyer of the Diocese of, well, I was Vice Chancellor of Tennessee when we had a chancellor, and I was the Vice Chancellor. But for the past 25 years, I've been Chancellor of West Tennessee.
Why did you choose to involve yourself so much in the Episcopal Church?
Well, I don't know that I ever stopped to rationalize it. It just, I grew up in Calvary Church. My father was hard of hearing, and we sat on the third row, right under the pulpit. We have an organization called the Episcopal Churchmen of Tennessee. The president asked me to be his treasurer, and as a result of that, I got to be president of the Episcopal Churchmen for 2 years.
Tell us about your service with the Boy Scouts.
Well, I was a scout. Actually, at that time I was 12 years old. We were living we had a farm at Poplar and Goodlet. Father, I mentioned earlier the farm out at Caperville, but Father had bought 100 acres at Poplar and Goodlet, running down Poplar to Bellmead, running down Goodlet to Walnut Grove, and he sold off 70 acres, which became the Gwynn Road subdivision, and that left 30 acres. And we had a dairy farm there until 1938 on that 30 acres. And then we put a street in, and first Tuckahoe Lane, and then that phased out the farm. And so, now what is your question?
About the Boy Scouts.
Oh, the Boy Scouts. What I was saying is that when I was 12, I really didn't see any need for the Boy Scouts because I was on a farm, and it was, I was 13, 12, 19, 26, or thereabouts. And, but I went to a boys' camp in North Carolina, and a boy in the same cabin with me was in a troop at St. John's Methodist Church, Troop 5, one of the early old troops. And when we got back, he said, "Why don't you go with me to a meeting?" And that introduced me, and I did get into scouting and went into that troop. And I became a life. I never did get Eagle. I lacked one merit badge, bird study. Otherwise, I would have been an Eagle Scout. But I did, when I came back here from law school, there was a troop at White Station School. The Improvement Club sponsored the troop. And then had a man, a scoutmaster, and he'd never been a scout. He wanted to get out of it, so they approached me, and in '38, I became scoutmaster of that troop. And except for the Navy war years, I kept that until about 1950. And then I was on the executive board and became president of the Chickasaw Council at one time.
How long have you practiced law?
Well, on September 1st, assuming I make it till then, that will be 67 years. I mean 70 years, I'm sorry. That'll be 70 years, 37 to 07.
Mm-hmm. What have you enjoyed most about the law practice, and what have you not enjoyed about it, if anything?
Well, speak of enjoy, I guess there's a satisfaction to helping people solve problems. I would say that is the main satisfaction of practicing law. I hear, well, I guess maybe it's on the television, about, about mediation. There used to be arbitration was the only thing. And arbitration was binding and is either black or white or yes or no or whatever. But mediation now, you let the parties, it's shaping the parties to talk and gain a point that is sufficiently satisfying to both sides that they settle it.
Did you enjoy courtroom trials?
Oh, I've never done a whole lot of litigation. Now, for 12 years, I was an assistant city attorney, and I was the main litigator, although I wouldn't have thought I would be, but I tried all of these sidewalk and street defect cases. Well, that's pretty good. The Supreme Court had held that, of course, you had to put the city on notice of a defect if you're going to collect from the city. And the sidewalk, most of the problems were where roots had pushed one slab up above another one. And the Supreme Court held that it had to be tall enough for the city to have notice of it, for the city to be liable. Well, if it was that tall, then the plaintiff should have seen it and is guilty of contributory negligence. So I had that going for me, and we never lost a case.
Are there recollections of other lawyers or judges that you'd like to share with us?
Well, yes. Judge Bates, probate. I've done a fair amount of probate. And you're a tax and estate planner. I didn't get into the tax as much as I did into the estate planning and handling, and part of that was because of the Mrs. Kosh and the Hamilton estate, and Ms. Waddell and her estate, but that's.
How would you rate the quality of judges when you began to practice?
That's why I say a Bates in the probate court, and he was then Chancellor Swepston, John E. Swepston, was one of the best in the Chancery Court. There were several in the Circuit Court. Now this is going way, way back. This way back. Harry Adams was Division I. Judge Med Capel was Division II. I'll skip Division III. And Division IV was Judge Laughlin. My brother married his daughter. And his son was Harry Laughlin, we all knew. Then the lawyers, Mr. Phil Canales Sr. was one of the top lawyers of the Memphis bar in those days. I sat in on, with my uncle, Will Metcalf, in the purchase. Mr. Canale was representing the heirs and the convent, and we negotiated the purchase of the half of the real estate. He was always just a top flight man. There were others, Mr. Sid Allen, Mr. Walter Armstrong. I'm throwing out names now. I didn't hobnob with those people, but they were top lawyers. Mr. Barron Evans was one of the top lawyers.
Did you consider a judgeship at any point?
Not really.
Why?
Why should I? I was practicing law. I think I sat one time for a one-day judge in the probate court is all I've ever sat.
Are there any stories you'd like to share with us, or any other comments you have?
Well, I thought maybe you were going to say cases.
Cases?
I have, of course, preparing for this, I've been thinking about it, and I think of two cases. One was a real landmark case because, and I don't want you to think ill of the Boy Scouts of America, because I was a council president. But about a couple of 3 years after I was president, we had an assistant executive. The executive was a fine man. The assistant was kind of, well, he was just kind of. And the executive board was about a 50-member board. We met monthly. And there was an annual meeting of the institutional representatives. That is, every church had a scout troop. They had a representative of that church was institutional representative. And they were council members, and then they would elect the officers. The executive board would elect the officers. So about 2 or 3 years after I was president, went to one of the annual meetings, and they had a nominating committee, and they announced their slate. And there were about 3 or 4 long-time, old-time scouters who were dropped by the nominating committee. Couldn't be any reason for that. So we tried to nominate somebody who had been dropped. And the president at that time ruled that nominations were not in order. They had to come through the nominating committee. So we went on, and we lost that year, but when we were approaching the next year, well, it was a boy named Williamson. He thought up the idea.
Now, who was your client in this, Charles?
Wait a minute, I haven't gotten to that yet. I'm still talking about the scouts.
Okay.
I was still on the board. They hadn't dropped me yet. But we formed a committee, and we met. We met in the basement of the William Lynn Hotel coffee shop. And that's what we said. That was our Rathskeller. You know, like Hitler had his meetings in the basement. So we got together several month or two before the annual meeting, and the idea was to get proxies, because Tennessee law, you can have proxies in general welfare corporations. And so we would meet and do it all on the QT. And finally, we were down to Friday before the annual meeting on Monday night. And we were meeting at the William Lynn, and I don't know who was. I don't know whether I did or somebody, but we developed the idea that we ought to give the administration a chance, let them know in advance. We don't want to just drop this on them. So we called on Friday. We called the president and said, now, we're going to put up some proxies for your meeting Monday night. Oh, well, let me check into that. So he calls New York, Chief Scout Executive up there. He said, no, they can't nominate. Got to go through the nominating committee. So Shep Tate and I got in my office on Saturday morning. We had, our offices were open on Saturday morning then. And together we dictated a complaint against Chickasaw Council, Boy Scouts of America, suing the Boy Scouts, saying that this was anticipating that they would do the same thing and not recognize. And so we had a meeting at my house on Sunday night, and we saw the assistant scout executive who was opposed to us was in his car out front of our house that night. But we had the committee meet and went over this complaint that Shep and I had drawn, and we met till late at night, and we went down and filed it Monday morning, Chancery Court. And so then we got in touch with them. They postponed the annual meeting. And then we tried this before Ceylon Frazier. And he held that we were entitled to nominate. And so that was pretty, pretty good.
Was that
for
appealed?
Us. What?
Was Ceylon's ruling appealed?
Yeah, I think they did appeal it. Yeah, but we were talking all this time, and I remember the chief scout executive, and he brought a lawyer with him from New York, came down to a meeting, and they sort of castigated us at the executive board because we'd done this. And finally, it went on. You see, the annual meeting should have been in December. And we were up into June before we finally resolved this. And we agreed to a slate of officers and board members, provided they would ask for nominations from the floor. We wouldn't nominate, but they would ask for nominations from the floor. And so they had the meeting. And sometime around that time, we heard that I think Alvin Tate was out at a meeting in Denver, and he said he's from Memphis. Memphis? Oh man, that's the place that's changed the scouts. So they accepted, and I don't know what they do now, but we did change to make it more democratic.
Has that been the hallmark of your practice, is talking about problems, negotiations, working with people?
I like to do that. I'm not a typical mediator. I'm not classified as a mediator. But I do like to talk things out. Now, the other case did go to the Supreme Court. And are we all right on time? I represented a man named Renan Kimbrough. He was in the cotton business, but he was also forward-thinking. And back at the time he came into this picture, Old Perkins, there's Old Perkins and there's Perkins Extended that crosses Poplar. Old Perkins, Cecil's was over on one corner, but on the southwest corner, right on the corner was a filling station, 150 by 150, right on that corner. John Barbee had that station for a while. It was an Exxon station. Well, the people who owned that owned down Poplar to beyond what is now Perkins Extended. It went to Goldsmiths and went from Poplar to the railroad. People named Dixon. And Kimbrough wanted to buy that property. So he went to see the Dixons who lived right back of the filling station that had been put in front their front yard. And they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but we have given an option to a man." I won't mention his name. But and when that option, it runs out on a certain day. So Kim went out there about an hour before that, maybe a half hour before that time. And he said, "Now, I'll tell you what, I'm going to offer you more than he's offering you. And I'll just wait here and see if he shows up." He sort of guessed that he might wait until the option expired and then go in and buy it for less. That's what he figured. So he waited at the stroke of whatever, the time it was up. He said, "Okay, now, here's a contract. I'd like to offer you this more money than you'd get from him, and here it is." And they signed the contract. They'd hardly finished signing it when the other man walked in, and they said, "No, we've sold it to Mr. Kimbrough." So he owned that property there. Well, there was a development on Perkins Extended. There was a development up here on Perkins, and that left some vacant land in between. And there's some question about if property doesn't front on a street. There's a private act, there was then at least, that said you couldn't record a deed that didn't front on a public street. At any rate, he had sold that parcel in the middle, and there'd been the man didn't pay for it. So he had this note, and I was the trustee under the deed of trust. So he had me foreclose. And I went down to the courthouse steps, and the debtor was represented by another lawyer, remained nameless, and but he was trying to mess up this sale, this foreclosure, and I knew that. So I finally said, "Who bid so-and-so?" Mr. Kimbrough bid the indebtedness, which is what you normally do. And this lawyer for the debtor bid, maybe $1,000 more. And so I called for any more bids. Kim didn't raise it because he's going to get paid. And so I knocked it off to the debtor. And I said, now this is a sale for cash, and where's the cash? And the lawyer said, "Oh, well, we'll give you the cash when we get the deed." I said, "Well, it's 12:25 now, and I'm going to adjourn this sale to my office, 1830 Exchange Building, and if the cash has not been paid by 2 o'clock in my office, this will be knocked off to Mr. Kimbrough, the second high bidder."
Okay, Charles, let's take a quick break, and we'll wrap up this when we get back.
Okay.
Thank you.